Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers, and I'm happy to have you join us here today. I want to thank our co-producers here in the studio today, Franz Salvatierra and Austin Armstrong. We also have an intern, Odie, who's joined in today. Appreciate all of the support, gentlemen, for creating what we do here. I want to extend an invitation to all of you who are viewing today to please submit questions as we go through the exercises and through some of the concepts we'll be talking about today. I really appreciate it. In our last meeting last week, we had several questions that were really pertinent, or comments that were really pertinent to the presentation. It really enriches it to create a sense of dialogue. So I highly recommend and invite you to do that. We've developed a means in the studio. If you submit a question, I'll respond to it anonymously, but it's projected up on a screen nearby where I can review it, and I'll try to weave it into my presentation as I course through it in real time. So I'd like you very much to feel like that you're invited into full dialogue with me, and I really do appreciate it. Also want to encourage you, this is with co-producer Austin's support here. I want to encourage you to, if you like this series and this episode today, to share it with friends, share it online, share it in Facebook. It helps us get the word out about the presentation and about this series, and we appreciate that. That's a way that you can help. Austin tells me that there's a new algorithm in Facebook now that really is rewarding kind of organic spread where people spread the word. And so it's in that spirit that I invite you to share this with others that you think might value from it. Also, it's in that spirit that I encourage you to interact. If you'd like to, it'd be great to hear where you're listening from. We have listeners from all around, and you can even write that into the chat function here as we're speaking to. So want to invite all of you to join in today as we proceed forward. As a quick review, last week we talked about addiction and shame in the context of relationships and recovery. As I shared with you last week when we met on Wednesday, I was invited to speak last Friday on this same topic to the local group, the Orange County chapter of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. And it was a significant invitation for me for lots of reasons, not the least of which was an opportunity to present to a group of therapists kind of the latest in addiction research and research in the treatment of addiction. I want you to know, just to say it briefly for today, the presentation was incredibly well received. I was really gratified. Lots of interest during the presentation. A lot of people came up afterwards and expressed enduring interest in following up on what we talked about. I created a bibliography for this presentation, and it occurs to me that if any of you that are viewing would be interested in receiving a copy of that bibliography, I'd be happy to send it to you. It's a bibliography of, I think it was 7 books or presentations. A couple of them are DVD presentations that have been the most seminal, the most foundational for me in recent years in terms of my work of deepening into addiction and recovery. And so I suggested these for the participants on Friday to review, and several of them wrote me to say that they're going to buy the books and get the DVDs and so on to get more information. I also cued them to this podcast, to Ask an Addiction Specialist podcast. And so again, there was interest amongst these professionals to find out what we're talking about here on Wednesdays. And so if you have interest in that bibliography, which includes a number of different resources, I'd be very happy to send it to you. So just write in today, leave your email address, and I'll get it to you. Okay, so thanks for your encouragement and support. And Friday was a resounding success. I'm really pleased to report that. Today our topic is twofold. We're in a series of discussing shame. shame in the context of recovery. And today we're going to be talking about shame as it's embodied. And I'll clarify what I mean by that shortly, because we're going to begin with an exercise in just a few minutes that will offer us an opportunity to identify shame in our physical selves. So we'll be looking at shame in the body. We'll also be looking at shame in what I call the in-between. That is shame in relationship and how it is typically hosted relationally. In fact, researchers in psychology that talk about shame discuss shame as being one of the interpersonal emotions, that it's hard to imagine shame without it having a relationship component. We'll be going into that today, as well as in our next presentation, which I'll say a little bit more about at the tail end today. So we'll be looking at shame in our bodies and shame in our relationships and how it manifests. To start with, let me tell you a story. I might have mentioned this on Friday in the presentation, and might have mentioned it here before, but never in this context. Is that when we talk about shame, that is the feeling of there's something wrong or bad about me, something defective. It's not something I've done, it's something I am. When we talk about that, it's oftentimes, and when I present this to the groups that I present to on a weekly basis, primarily young men and young women who are early in recovery from oftentimes severe addiction, when we broach the topic of shame, most can identify the concept, but it's hard for them to identify with it personally in terms of their own lives. And it's led me to reflect on this, and this is born out of now a few years of doing this work with clients here locally, that shame is less of a conscious thought, or it's less accessible in the conscious mind than it is a felt sense in the body. And if we enter in through the senses and in through the body and in through feelings, we might have a better anchor point for understanding how shame locates itself in our lives. And so in that spirit, what I'd like to do today is take 5 to 10 minutes of a meditation that I'll guide us through. And the meditation is, I'll introduce the meditation specifically in just a moment, but it's done with intentionality. And the thought here is that talking about many psychological or spiritual phenomena, talking about them doesn't quite get to it. In philosophy, sometimes this is referred to in this phrase: the map is not the territory. We can talk about a map, but it's not the actual territory that the map attempts to describe. And it's a bit of that problem when we talk about a very private feeling or emotion such as shame, particularly because shame, insofar as it's linked to self-loathing, doesn't really want to present itself to the light of day for any of us. To put it this way, we experience shame and then we're ashamed of feeling shame. And so there's actually a fair literature around shame in psychology that talks about how we defend against shame. And I had a course many years ago, one of my introductions to shame, an advanced course in studying shame amongst a group of psychotherapists, and we spent a good bit of time looking at defenses against shame. We've talked about this even recently, talking about work with men that I work with who are being asked to come forward and acknowledge wrongs that they've done, including to the women in their lives. I'm thinking of the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement right now. And one of the real tripping points for men is that men are coached from day one virtually in our society to not express vulnerability. And shame is certainly one of the most, if not the most, vulnerable emotions. Far easier for a man to be angry, as we've talked about, or for a man to distance, for a man to flee, than to stand and own rightful responsibility for wrongs. And why is that difficult? Well, because it's typically experienced as shame, as self-judgment, self-condemnation. And to express that feeling would be to express something that men have been trained to believe as weakness. And so it makes it very challenging. So the thought behind the meditation today is let's not talk about it. Let's not draw another map of shame. Let's see if we can dip into an experience in the here and now. And some of you, I'm hoping this will work for all of you, but for some of you this may be particularly helpful, and for others it may be more difficult. But what I want to do is guide us through a 5 or 10 minute meditation whose goal is twofold. One is to get into a steady state, kind of a baseline that is peaceful and relaxed. And then to evoke a memory of shame and notice how that feels, and then come back together as a group and field your experiences. This will be a time when, once we complete this meditation, where I'll really encourage you to share as you're willing to, as I can share with the group here, and I promise to do that confidentially. Okay, so the exercise is this. I'm going to invite you to get settled into a chair. It's helpful if you're in a quiet environment. I told the 3 gentlemen here in the room earlier they were going to be having a meditation, and that it wasn't time to bring out the trumpet and start playing. So I think they're going to be particularly quiet right now, and it will help you if you're in a quiet environment. Maybe if for nothing else, to stay focused. And we're going to do a very simple meditation. It's a mindfulness meditation that we've done here before, but it's going to be a little additional postscript to it today. So I'm going to close my eyes. I encourage you to do that if you're okay with that. If not, just lower your eyes and look at the floor. Maybe just some way to reduce distraction can help. That's why I'm closing my eyes right now. And take in a deep breath. And release that when you're ready. Take in another breath, breathing in deeply all the way down into your belly. And release that when you're comfortable. On the next breath in, see if you can notice the rising in your belly and focus your attention there, and the falling of your belly when you exhale. So rising and falling, breathing in, breathing out. Do that again. Now, it's very natural, even in a brief exercise like this, for the mind to come in with thoughts, worries about the future, regrets about the past. Sometimes it's sensations, sounds, feelings that we get distracted by. Sometimes it's emotions. So what we're going to do is continue for a couple of more breath cycles. And as you breathe in and breathe out, very gradually, slowly, focusing on the sensations associated with the breathing. As you get distracted by a thought, just simply label it as thinking, and then set it on an imaginary shelf in your mind. Let it go, and then bring your attention gently back to your breath. So let's try that for a couple of breath cycles. Breathing in, breathing out, labeling thoughts as they arise, and then back to the breath. To deepen the meditation now, we're going to go through various sense portals in the body, 7 of them in fact, and we'll do this for the next few minutes, and I invite you to join me here in the spirit of just dropping into more of a centered, relaxed frame of mind and body. So on the next breath cycle, as you breathe in and breathe out, allow your body to settle down into a chair if you're sitting, or if you're resting in a couch or a bed, let it settle there. In other words, allow gravity just to kind of have its way with your body and let go into it. So breathing out, breathing in, and then release and let go and let your body go limp. And notice how that feels. On the next breath cycle, as you breathe in, Scan your body from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head for variations in temperature. For example, you may feel a bit more cool in your feet and your ankles, and as you go up your body, feel warmth in your midsection, and to the top of your head where your face is exposed, maybe experience more coolness. So just a breath cycle to focus on temperature differences across your body. For example, I feel a coolness in the chair that I'm sitting in. It's not the kind of thing that we typically notice. At least I don't typically notice that. And this gives us a chance to focus a bit more with our sensations than we typically do. Again, if you get distracted by a thought, it's not a worry. Just gently label it, set it on a shelf, and come back to the exercise. Let's do another breath cycle, just focusing on the sensation of the breath in your belly, rising and falling. Okay. On the next couple of breath cycles, let's focus on something quite subtle, namely your heartbeat. See if you can detect your heartbeat inside your chest without placing your hand on your chest, if you can detect it from inside. This is subtle and you may not experience it, but see if you do. So a couple of breath cycles, just focusing your attention on your pulse from within. On the next breath cycle, just drop your attention to your midsection, to your GI tract, and see what you feel there in terms of digestion. Are you full? Are you hungry? Maybe you've got some indigestion. Just notice what's going on in that part of your body. A breath cycle devoted to that. Okay, just two more. On the next one, start from the top of your head down to the bottom of your feet. Scan your body for any muscle tension or aches and pains, for example, in your joints. From your head to your feet. Just scan your body for any kind of achiness, soreness, or maybe there's none, and just enjoy how that feels. Okay, the last part of this exercise in meditation, I'm going to add an exercise right after this, staying in this state. The last is just to focus on what you hear. No matter where you are, notice the relative quiet, the relative silence, as long as that's what you experience. So right here, there's the pitter-pattering of fingers on keyboard keys, but it's not very noisy. And there's 4 men in a very closed space. It's pretty dadgum quiet. So just appreciate, if you can, what you hear and notice the silence and the gaps between sounds. Good. And notice how you feel right now. It's possible this exercise has put some of you to sleep. I don't consider that a complete failure. I think if we can relax our bodies enough to be able to rest, that's probably a good thing. But assuming that you're still alert and still with us, you probably are in a more relaxed state than you were 5-10 minutes ago. Now I want to add something to the mix here. I want you to join me in this. I'd like you to identify an experience, I think recent is better because it's fresher in your mind, an experience in which someone said something or did something Maybe it's the way they looked at you or even a tone of voice that made you feel awful about yourself. In other words, somebody said or did something that shamed you. I want you to do this. I want you to take a moment to identify a recent interaction in which you experienced shame. And then I'd like you to scan your body for how that feels in your body now as you remember. And so we're going to do a body scan from head to foot just to notice, how does the memory of a shaming interaction feel in my body even right now? Scan your body from head to toe to see what comes up for you in terms of a body sense around being shamed. And when you're ready, open your eyes and we'll come back to the discussion. Thank you. I want to invite you to share, if you're willing, to share with the group what it is that you experienced in this meditation, specifically the latter part as regards remembering a shaming experience. I'll tell you what happens when I share this with groups that I lead, what people will share. I'll share what came up for me right now. It's not unusual for somebody to share. In fact, recently I had two men share that they have a tightness in the middle of their chest is what they experience. And that they'd experienced that open up in their earlier meditation and it closes down when they remember back into shame. Others talk about a tightness in the throat. I've heard people talk about pressure in their belly or their gut. I've had other people talk about heat flushing through their body. So it can be heat in their face, they start sweating. I led a group earlier today where a gentleman to the left of me said he could feel his heart beating out of his chest with the memory of the shame. Today in the exercise, I remembered a recent experience in which shame was evoked for me. And what I was struck by is that my eyes felt teary. I could feel my eyes tear up. And I could also feel this heaviness in my heart. It literally feels in my heart like a heaviness in my heart. You can move the next slide, perhaps. So these are examples of what happens in the body when we remember into shame. And I want to talk a little bit about why we're even focusing on this body sense around shame. And again, I invite you to share as you wish about your own experiences. Is that psychology has taught us that shame originates in the deepest part of the brain. It's referred to as the emotional center of the brain. The more technical term is the limbic system of the brain. And so if you think about the top part of the brain, this front part up here, the frontal cortex, cortex is just a word for bark. So the outer bark of the brain. What's inside that is the subcortex. And shame's origin is subcortical. That means it's underneath the bark. It's underneath the outside of our brain. And there's some significance in our identifying where shame originates. A couple of things come to mind. First of all, shame is not a rational process. It doesn't really route itself through the thinking, rational part of the frontal cortex in our brain. It's actually located much more in the interior of the brain. And so it's not rational. It's why when somebody says, you shouldn't be ashamed, it's sometimes hard to apply that because that's not the problem. It's not like you need advice. It's something's been activated from inside. And the second part of that is that the interior part of the brain, the emotional center, is very much linked to our survival, and it operates very quickly. And so shame is not only, it bypasses the rational mind, but it's very quick in terms of its onset. And who of us doesn't know that, where you move from 0 to 60 in a shaming encounter and can be swamped by it almost instantaneously. We talk about how it is that addiction hijacks the brain. Well, shame does that too. And what we mean in talking about addiction this way and comparing it to shame is that both addiction and shame are similar insofar as they're rooted in the interior part of the brain. And in fact, addiction shuts down the frontal cortex, which is, as we've talked about before, which is why those that are in active addiction will make choices that violate their own moral code regularly. The part of the brain that operates in terms of morals, makes sound judgment, thinks rationally, plans ahead, even operates with compassion towards others. All of that requires an intact, active frontal cortex. And if you shut that down or bypass that or hijack that, then what you're left with very predictably are the baser instincts that are basically fight, flight, or freeze. And so you get these very basic survival instincts. They operate very quickly. And if you think about it, they're there for our survival. So for example, if I'm afraid in the presence of a threat, it makes a lot of sense for that to operate quickly and definitively in my brain to move me towards safety. Well, unfortunately, and we've talked about this some in previous podcasts, to which I recommend you review, is that shame represents a threat to my social acceptance and a threat to my self-esteem. And the body responds to these threats just as if it were a saber-toothed tiger. It's a very quick, non-rational response. And it moves with shame oftentimes into the most immediate response is a freeze reaction where it just paralyzes us. So when I ask my groups when I meet with them, what's the relevance of our talking about this inner part of the brain that gets so activated around both shame and addiction? Why is it important that we talk about this in the context of recovery? And as you go into this, especially if you experience in this exercise any discomfort with the feelings that arose and the physical sensations that are attached to those feelings, there's not an individual that I know in early recovery from addiction that wouldn't quickly understand that self-medicating that feeling, those sensations, is something that they're all familiar with, as am I in my own recovery. And so when shame gets activated so quickly, so automatically, bypassing the brain is hijacked. When shame gets activated in interactions, it's a huge trigger. In fact, some would say the strongest trigger for relapse to addiction is shame. Is some combination of a threat to my being accepted in a social group, and the flip side of that, a threat to my self-esteem. And we'll do almost anything not to feel that, including to self-medicate with alcohol and other drugs. So that's looking at shame as an embodied feeling. And I think it's probably closer to the experience of shame to engage with it the way that we have. I want to continue now. I want to move into talking about shame in the in-between. And I'm going to tie this back to what we've talked about in terms of shame's being embodied in just a few moments. Let me ask you this. Have you experienced in interactions, especially with people that you care about, have you experienced being slimed? This is my best image of being slimed, okay? Have you experienced that? Who of us hasn't experienced what it's like to be slimed in a relationship? And the body sense that goes with that, and the emotional reactions that go with that. It's universal. In the last 20 years in psychology, there's been the introduction for the first time of advanced ways of scanning the brain scan technology that make it possible for us to look at what goes on in the brain when we're slimed. For that matter, to look at what goes on in the brain when we feel loved. Any of the interpersonal interactions that we have register in the brain. We never could access them before, at least non-invasively without brain surgery. We couldn't access them before, but it's now possible. I started graduate school all those years ago, nearly 40 years ago, and my first courses were in neurobiology, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. And all that we were studying was based on, in fact, I remember as part of the course, we had as part of our lab each week, is we had to look at slides of sheep brain to understand what the brain is like, because we didn't even look at human brains. And you sure as heck couldn't look at any brain, whether it's sheep or human, in real time. It just was not possible. And it is now possible with functional magnetic resonance scanning and other forms of scanning. So we have brain scan technology at our disposal. We understand addiction in a way that we never did before, because most of the things that we hear about traditionally about addiction were hypotheses generated pre-brain scan, and there's a tremendous richness of information. In fact, the bibliography that I mentioned earlier lists a number of resources that go deeply into what we now know about addiction, now that we're able to observe the addictive brain in action, as well as the brain in recovery. Interpersonal neurobiology has followed on this brain scan technology, and it's a big mouthful of a word, but basically what it means is this. It's looking at what happens in relationship, interpersonal, and how that affects the brain, the neurons in the brain, the neural networks in the brain. That's the nerve cells in the brain from a biological perspective. So it's really the wedding of psychology, and particularly social psychology and what's referred to as attachment theory, how we react in relationships. It's connecting to that too. Brain scan technology and neurobiology in a way that's incredibly rich and incredibly relevant to talking about addiction and recovery, and certainly are talking about shame as an example. You can look at shame and other strong emotions in the brain, and they actually register, for example, in a brain organ called the thalamus. Emotional pain registers the same way that physical pain does. And if you look at it strictly from a brain perspective, you can't distinguish whether somebody just got poked with a needle or they just got shamed. It shows up as pain in the brain. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? What's that phrase? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is not accurate. Words do hurt us, and they register as pain, and now we have evidence of that. I think we always knew that, right? In regards to the contributions of contemporary science and technology, there's a term that has now been studied and used widely in this domain of interpersonal neurobiology. It's referred to as co-regulation. The idea is that most of the conventional knowledge is that my brain resides inside my skull, and yours does too. With the advent of advanced techniques of studying the brain through brain scans, we now know that the brain radiates throughout the body, and there's actually now reference made in the scientific literature to what's called the gut brain, is that literally in our gut we have all kinds of nerve fibers that respond particularly to safety. And in the absence of safety, the stomach problems that arise, and all of us have some version of that experience, those are really tied to the gut brain. There's now referred to, also a phenomenon referred to as the heart brain, is that when we talk about somebody's breaking our heart, while it doesn't literally break the heart, it does affect the heart region, and so there's innervation in the heart region. And so we're talking about the brain as a full-bodied experience more and more, and even more radically when I introduce the term of co-regulation, is the idea that we share brains. And so, for example, if you're upset at me and you're judging me, that you can look at me and I'll be on the receiving end of that judgment. Is that words only serve to reinforce what I already felt or intuited. The same with love, is that love and connection or attachment register in the brain, and that being in the presence of somebody who cares for us, who has compassion, radically impacts our own brain function, our own brain processes, and of course our emotional processes that are attached to those. So I want to suggest a second exercise before we wind up today, and this is, I'd like you to go back to that initial instance where you thought of something or somebody that shamed you. Somebody said something that made you feel awful about yourself. There's something wrong with you, something bad about you, something defective about you, something hopeless about you. I want you to go back to that instance. And I'd like you to see if you can identify in your own mind's eye how that experience might connect to other experiences earlier in your life that themselves were shaming. That is to say, the recent experience of shame, I thought of one that just happened to me in the middle of last week, how that connects to earlier messages that I may have gotten, could be in my family of origin, it could have been with friends of mine, it could have been with teachers or other influential people in my life. See if you can make a mental connection right now between what happened more recently, that we identified in the earlier exercise, and something that happened more distant in time that connects to a similar feeling and even a similar message, like a similar nuance of how that shame came through. I want to give you a minute to do that. If you have a piece of paper handy, you can write it down to yourself. You're welcome to share it here. I'd invite you to do that if you care to. But the most important thing is for you to identify it, linking current with past around the shame. Encourage you to spend more time if you're interested in journaling out some of the thoughts and associations that come up for you. I'm really struck by it right now. The example that I came up with for myself earlier, I didn't. I wanted to do this exercise with you, so I waited till I got here to actually come up with a recent example. And what I'm struck by is that recent example, which I just generated, just came to my mind while we were doing the earlier meditation. It connects to an earlier experience that actually connects to a number of experiences, but it's so striking to me how powerfully connected they are. And do you remember how I said earlier that shame is subcortical? Next slide. That shame's origin is subcortical. If you're able to connect up what we just identified earlier in the meditation, if you're able to connect that up with an earlier experience in your life, chances are that wasn't explicit for you any more than it was for me. It literally did not, the connection did not become clear until I took a moment right now to reflect with you during this more recent exercise. Shame's origin is subcortical, and all I mean by that is you don't have to remember it to feel it. In fact, most often we don't remember it. We don't have words for it. We don't have a narrative about it, but we feel it in our bodies, and it will manifest in terms of how we react in relationship. So if shame's origin is subcortical, I want you to know that the intent of today's entire podcast is to come up with an antidote to shame, and shame's antidote is to move it from being subcortical to being cortical. And all I mean by that is our being able to think about, remember, even write down, verbalize shame as we experience it now, shame as it may attach to experiences from the past, and the awareness that those may link. That's the beginnings of our beginning to bring shame out of the darkness into the light. And one thing we know for sure is that shame doesn't do well in the light. And so this is the basis of so many of the support groups that you hear about, including the 12-step support groups that are widely utilized in addiction recovery and other support groups as well, is that the rule of the game is that you come in and you talk about the most shameful experiences, often attached to active addiction, in a group of peers that not only don't judge that, but expect that you're going to do that. And so it's the idea of lancing the wound and bringing it to the light of day, exposing it to fresh air, that itself is healing or an antidote to the shame. Shame loves secrecy, loves hiddenness, and it avoids at all costs being opened into conversation, into self-awareness. This next slide, I came across this online. I like this saying, I think it's pertinent here, that you must go into the dark in order to bring forth your light. Reminds me of another saying. It's an ancient Chinese saying attributed to Lao Tzu, where he said, the heavy is the root of the dark is the root of the light. The dark is the root of the light. Is that you have to get down to the roots in the darkness to get down to things that we're talking about right now that are buried deep in our psyches, in our brains literally, in order to flesh them out and bring them into the light. And you've just done that today. So these conversations are about unpleasant feelings, but part of what we're doing is we're talking about specific memories. There's this idea in co-regulation that as you share with me and as I share with you, we lighten the burden by sharing the reality of our experiences of emotions like shame. We actually lean on each other, and there's a buttressing or a support that goes on that helps to create new possibilities. You remember how I mentioned earlier that shame is a freeze emotion? It causes us to be paralyzed in our tracks. If I can expose my shame to you, if I can share it with you in a trusted relationship, and you with me, as we begin to unfreeze ourselves. This is why it's so important, particularly in early recovery, for individuals to have multiple forms of support. I recommend a therapist or a coach. I recommend support groups. I recommend as much getting out of this material as possible, because it won't do to keep addiction in the shadows. It won't do to keep whatever emotions are tied into the addictive behaviors or shameful thoughts about oneself, etc. It won't do to keep those secret. They need to be brought out to be shared in order to expose them for what they are and to support ongoing sobriety. Looks like there's a comment that's come in. Thank you for sharing. Do you have any suggestions for who or what situations are safe or healing to bring your shame out into the open? Any suggestions for who or what situations? It's a great question. It's a great question. First of all, I think you can instinctively know those that you can share with by virtue of their response, and especially if it's somebody that you've known for a while. We collect various relationships in our lives. I've got them in my life as well, people that we interact with that you know that you wouldn't bare your soul to, you wouldn't share, because there's a fundamental either lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, or a proneness to judgment. In my case, a proneness to advice. If I share something vulnerable with someone, I want to trust that they can be with me, not be overwhelmed by my experience, nor invade me with advice that I'm really not looking for. And so on an individual basis, I think it really takes trusting instincts and kind of sorting out the wheat from the chaff in terms of those that we can trust into these places. I think it's rare. I think it can be very helpful to find others that have been through similar experiences and are willing to share with similar vulnerability. I find great value in the various groups that I'm involved in. I'm involved in several support groups a week, some of them in person, some of them online, where those that are engaged in the community are committed to confidentiality. They're not going to share what we've talked about. That's important, to honor the privacy, to keep a container for that. They're also willing to be with me and hold what I'm bringing without judgment, but rather respond with compassion. They're willing to share themselves, challenges, that they can be with me, and when the time comes, that they can share pearls of wisdom and that I'll be receptive. I really advocate the various support groups that are available. The ones I'm most aware of or have been involved in include the 12-step groups, AA and NA. I have a lot of respect for their process. I also recommend Smart Recovery as an alternative for those that don't find AA the right language for them. There's a lot of good support in Smart Recovery. I've been active locally, regionally, in what's referred to as Refuge Recovery, which is a mindfulness-based recovery, which is very appealing to me, where there's built-in mindfulness meditation into each meeting. That represents a good fit for me. I'm very involved in an online community called the Integral Recovery Community, which is a holistic approach, body, mind, and spirit. And in all of these venues that I've been involved in and continue to be involved in, I have found safety and certainly healing that's both given and received, and I have high value for that. There was a research study done at Harvard some years ago looking at the healing factors in these support groups. What is it that's healing? It was a scientific study, so it wasn't going to be looking at religious beliefs per se, but what happens in these groups. And what they found were two things. One is that there's a safe place to share your story, and it gets into this business of co-regulation, is that the support can make all the difference. You're not alone in this. And then secondly, and interestingly, there's an opportunity for what the study referred to as altruism, where you're able to help others. And in the act of helping others, we help ourselves. And so I recommend for sure finding groups that have a track record of being safe and healing, and building relationships as we're able in terms of friendships where we can find the same. Those are precious for sure. Thank you for the question. It's a really important question. So what we've done today is attempted to bring shame to light by both identifying the fact that we can't often name it, it's more of a felt sense in the body, and that it shows up interpersonally, and it affects us immediately, and that's the slime experience, and that there's help available if we can find relationships that are facilitative, supportive, where we can work through the shame that we've experienced. We tied together how it is that current shame is typically attached to earlier shame. Templates, blueprints, patterns are laid down earlier on that end up being with us right into the present. And so there's this sense of kind of a cascade of previous interactions that get evoked in the current interaction. I want to thank you for being with us today. And I want to say this, in 2 weeks, we won't be meeting next week. In 2 weeks, I want to come back to this idea of templates or patterns. And we're going to go more deeply into this, looking at shame as regards patterns in our lives. And then, as always, ways that we might change this. Today, what we've talked about is if you can identify in your body. In fact, I just asked a group, what's the value of being able to identify shame in your body? And one of the respondents said, if I can identify it, then I can do something about it. And this is one of the tricky things about shame, is it'll go unseen, kind of unacknowledged, because as I said, it bypasses the intellect, and yet it has its negative effects. So if I can identify it, then I can do something about that. Whether it's personally, I can work on self-regulation, calming myself, or if it's interpersonally, I can work on addressing whatever happened. And it's impossible to do that if you can't identify it. So it's really key that we be able to identify it in our bodies. And then we've talked about how it locates itself in the relational realm. And I think there's a key here, and it's implied in the earlier question, it seems to me too, is that we do well to take root as much as possible in relationships that are non-shaming. And so, as we'll talk about in our next podcast in 2 weeks, unfortunately, oftentimes what happens is that what are laid down earlier on are not only templates for relationships, but expectations, including expectations that it's normal to be in a relationship that makes me feel bad about myself. I had another conversation today in another context where the individual was sharing where in marriage, that this person was experiencing invalidation over and over again. And what this person said is that it's not even that I feel bad about myself thinking about shame, it's that I doubt myself, which is almost another face of shame, is that I doubt myself. I don't have enough confidence to trust my own instincts. And so there it is that in current relationships, we can persist with patterns that we've gotten from childhood on. And what we're talking about is challenging that paradigm, challenging that model by, well, I'll use the title of the groups that I lead. We call it unshaming. We're working on unshaming ourselves here. So I want to thank you all for your participation. Be sure to share this with others that might be interested in the topic. Also for you to know, Franz and Austin, it was an interesting slip. There's a psychologist named Franz Alexander. I put them together. Franz and Austin, and maybe Franz Alexander too. I'll tell you this, Franz Alexander is the one who coined the term corrective emotional experience, and it pertains to this insofar as the relationships that I'm in today can correct a multitude of traumas and other wounds from the past. Our current relationships have the capacity of healing our brains, our bodies, our souls, and so they're really important. So Franz and Austin and Franz Alexander tell me that we have archived footage that you can go back to. I see there's a question here. You can go back, you can go through Ask an Addiction Specialist. You can also go to YouTube and view now an entire series of over 20 videos that have been around addiction and recovery, focusing especially on what we can do to unshame ourselves. Oh, this individual said they came on late, and that they're gonna be checking out the video. If you came on late and you want to catch the earlier, do what this individual is doing and review at your own leisure online. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 weeks. I also want to mention that if you're interested in viewing other resources that are available around this topic of shame, I'm currently finishing a book called Unshaming. You can go and see plenty of blog resources and other videos that I've done over time at my own website, drbobweathers.com. You're welcome to go there. It's all freely given. It's meant as a clearinghouse, a resource for you, so I hope that you'll find that useful. You can also reach out to me directly, either online through the Facebook community here, or you can reach me through my website, and I respond to any number of people each week who just write a quick note to me in my website, and I get back to you through your email, okay? So blessings to you. Take care. I will see you in 2 weeks. Blessings to all.